Counter-Narrative News wanted to bring you an important critique and reflection of the 20 years of the One Extra music channel and platform, which is a part of the BBC. So really it's 20 years of what one would argue is the British racist and colonial state control and management of the black cultural grassroots by means partially and significantly by BBC One Extra. Being the 20th anniversary of BBC's One Extra, it's worth taking a bit more of a time to examine and look more closely at the agendas of BBC One Extra and what have been the outcomes in relation to black African heritage and African Caribbean heritage grassroots, especially in England but further afield as well. It's really important to understand the historical context of when BBC One Extra was launched. Launched in August 2002, BBC One Extra was initially going to be called Network X. Its first promotion stated it was going to promote street music and new black music. The name eventually became BBC One Extra, with the network going to the BBC's other big project focused on Asian or Asian-centric audiences. That's BBC Asian Network. That was launched a few months after One Extra on digital radio in October 2002. Interesting to note that the BBC felt it necessary and correct for itself to have one big new platform for Asian people and another one for black people, much in line with an old British colonial divide and rule tactic of racist marginalisation of colonised peoples, African Asian peoples, while giving them their own sectional spaces to attempt to bribe a small layer of the respective community in manipulating it to be appreciative of the divide and rule agenda and the few crumbs for this veritable mercenary colonial class. In 2002, when BBC One Extra was launched, it was a time when black music is becoming increasingly more confident. It's increasing in its artistic creativities, its grassroots cultures, pushing in general outwards from the black community to the general community. Having fought the battle to survive and carve out the own grassroots spaces through the 1960s, 70s and 80s into the 90s, by the end of the 90s and the start of the 2000s, black grassroots culture is getting more popular than ever based on independent grassroots formations, be it in the form of illegal pirate radio stations connected to raves and clubs and independent record labels and record shops. Black grassroots music is seeing increasingly popular success with house and garage at this time, but also jungle and grime acts, so Solid, General Levy, Dizzy, Wiley, to name a few. Grime has just really begun as the latest black grassroots-led new music and cultural form, and it opens up a new high level of technical and lyrical expertise of MC culture, seeing nearly every classroom and every school consisting of black and brown and sometimes white youth at the age of over 12 years old wanting to become an MC in this new kind of burgeoning mass MC culture in the early 2000s. From having known rappers mostly from the USA, at this period young people now are starting to know more rappers from their own communities in Britain than what was hitherto from the USA. Also the early 2000s, a time when communication technology is changing very fast. On the cusp of mass smartphone ownership, the internet becomes a central means of communication. However, pirate radio outside of the digital sphere is still very popular and, of course, independent. Not only independent, but in a strategic battle with the British state that is constantly playing a cat and mouse game with the communities of independent pirate radio and their communities. Culture, especially musical culture from the grassroots, is an expression and it's an articulation, it's a reflection of where the grassroots feel that they are. And it's from the grassroots to their social, political, cultural and spiritual conditions and challenges of which they express themselves. This same period sees the socio-political conditions of the black working class communities as continue to face growing pressure around overcrowded housing and unaffordable housing, employment, policing, education, and fast disappearing sports and cultural facilities in the ends or in our communities. At the time, black communities are still relatively confident, having and continuing to conduct political struggles around deaths in police custody. The end of the 90s saw a massive wave of uproar from black communities around issues such as the racist killing of Stephen Lawrence and the absolutely racist manner in which the police dealt with that issue. Same with Roland Adams and Cynthia Jarrett. These new campaigns starting up around the racist police killings of Ricky Reel and also Christopher Older, still ongoing campaigns to this day. It was a time of relative confidence, definitely fast developing confidence around black music and culture, which was based on a mosaic of networks and circles not controlled and outside of the orbit of the British state and big capitalist interests, but local groups of usually quite young people and sometimes entrepreneurs, such as Channel U, showed how a very small operation could become the most popular cultural channel for young people in Britain. A little later, Jamal Edwards shows with his SBTV, using the YouTube platform, how one person and his team could elevate the black cultural grassroots to a well-supported and popular platform. Finally, 2002 is in between the 9/11 attacks and the British USA invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, and then also the occupation of Iraq, and the connected anti-Muslim hysterical racism that was being promoted by the government and mainstream media at the time. Growing independent media stations, be it on pirate or on TV or on the internet, a confident black grassroots community in independent control of that growing media in a context of suddenly rocketing racism and wars conducted by the British state was just a bad situation in totality for the British state. Those who were emceeing in Jungle, D&B and House and Garage at the time and playing in different pirate stations, etc., some of which can attest that this was a time really where you could oppose this growing racism and colonial culture and link these directly in a form of communication and cultural resistance through the means of communication, the music and the culture, to the communities in Britain and further afield across the world. At the same time, there was an explosion of creativity around grime culture and specifically MCing. You could hear all the time contemporary peers experimenting with ideas, reflecting on society and what was taking place in a very intense political climate at the time. You have to remember hundreds of thousands of school children walked out of their schools in protest against the British invasion and occupation of Iraq. And this also fed into this new MC culture that allowed young people to articulate themselves. This new grime culture was profound in many ways. So the British state needed to literally bring all this independent grassroots culture led by black working class youth to an end. They needed to halt the self-organization of young working class communities because it could go in directions of unity and struggle and pushing back on the British state's agendas who were vested in deepening poverty, racism and war. The BBC is very sophisticated and a highly experienced cultural arm of the British colonial state. It is probably the single most successful colonial platform in the world, being predicated directly on the British colonial oppression of the world. The BBC World Service radio station was very popular in colonial times amongst the colonised people. In the BBC One Extra's 20th anniversary 1-hour video feature called Homegrown, 20 Years of One Extra, Shawnee B even explicitly references this in context of Jamaica, arguing that it was the BBC World Service which laid the basis for the popularity of BBC's One Extra platform, of which Shawnee B is the main frontman in Jamaica. So you can see clearly that there's a seamless continuation of the British colonial agenda through its World Service and One Extras. And One Extra starts to scoop up all the grassroots talents into its orbit and hegemony. One Extra helps to end the era of independent illegal pirate radio culture and monopolizes a lot of that into its own BBC-controlled regime. This is super important. Pirate radio culture was such an important way for the grassroots young people to communicate with themselves independently. There will always be a great deal of talent, but also a great deal of desperation of artists to get out of economic relative precarity at the grassroots. So you're always going to have a demand from the grassroots that things like the BBC give them some airtime and money. The point is that with its massive resources and cultural hegemony, of course BBC One Extra was going to be able to appropriate a massive, if not majority section of the culture into its own monopolization. Black grassroots had made the success of the BBC One Extra. BBC One Extra has not made a success of black grassroots culture. Repeat, the black grassroots have made the successes for BBC One Extra. BBC One Extra has not made a success of the black cultural grassroots. The grassroots culture would have continued to be diverse and vibrant if there was no British state intervention to dominate it through One Extra. At the same time, the grassroots, by their very nature and the dynamics of capitalist colonial exploitation and oppression, which they or we, whatever our community increasingly face, will always produce endless beautiful expressions of resistance through culture, because that's just the science of oppression at the grassroots, that it creates this artistic expressions. The above mentioned BBC One Extra 20th anniversary documentary spans the last 2 decades, but interestingly, although unsurprisingly, does not include the leading role of Tim Westwood in the project. Tim Westwood was a senior figure on the platform for well over a decade. It's now exposed what many people already knew, that Tim Westwood was, perhaps is, still an organised sexual abuser of young women and girls, targeting especially young black women. Of course, Westwood also had to be that very cringe white man type of person, in that his dress, posture and way of talking was like a ridiculization and a racist characterization of what he thinks, in his white lens, what black culture is. Westwood also conducts parties with young black crews, some of who end up in prison or being killed. Is the BBC One Extra and Westwood there to support these people and their traumatized families? No. It's a relationship of racist and colonial use and abuse. Westwood also decided to support the British colonial war in Afghanistan by flying out there to put on shows for British colonial soldiers involved in torture, rape and death. This open promotion of British violent racism promoted by Westwood and BBC One Extra is what it is. The BBC are in a panic as to how to handle the Westwood scandal now, which perhaps indicates that we are seeing only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the amount of organised abuse here, and it's likely a lot more things and people are going to be implicated in the crimes of Westwood and the associates in the BBC and possibly One Extra itself, but it requires a grassroots campaign to put that pressure on to expose what further is going to be exposed. Westwood and BBC One Extra perform a very important task here to push Asian and African heritage people away from each other on the basis of supporting a British colonial war against an Asian, i.e. Afghan people, and promote the greatest, most violent racist entity ever known to humanity, the British Army. While there is no doubt mass sympathy for victims of British wars in Asia of the last 20 years, from all communities, including African heritage communities, it's still a big agenda and a largely successful one of the British state that they did all they could to ensure black and brown youth don't unite in their common interests of opposing police oppression, the housing crisis, diminishing employment and educational opportunities, and generally growing racism and poverty. BBC One Extra has been a very important colonial tool in these very primary colonial strategies of the British ruling classes. The documentary Homegrown 20 Years of One Extra, spanning the last 20 years, only mentions one social political incident explicitly, and that is the racist police killing of George Floyd. Nothing much is said in these few minutes on the issue. Pressing issues such as the Windrush scandal, Grenfell, Brexit, August 2011 uprising, born from the racist police lynching and killing of Mark Duggan, and many more issues are just absent in the piece. In the entire last 20 years, it's indicative of BBC One Extra's manipulation and rewriting of history that nothing really has happened in the black community apart from something that happened in the USA. The video also conveniently edits out some of the most politically radical rappers that have appeared on their show, and especially on Fire in the Booth, often delivering the best Fire in the Booth that there's ever been. The video does of course mention some anti-black racism in Britain, but only to raise it to say that somehow One Extra has been a great contribution against this racism. The black grassroots know very well that despite misperceptions in the mainstream media, that racism is back with a vengeance on every level against black and brown people. The One Extra video Homegrown also awkwardly attempts to navigate the problem of racism in Britain when it comes to the black grassroots music and culture and mass racism on an institutionally but also a popular level amongst British white people against black and brown and migrant communities. The setting up of BBC One Extra is presented by the powers there as helpful to the black communities in the context of racism, but the opposite is true. Why give black people a special black platform? Why not just include it in the mainstream Radio 1 platform properly? The answer is that the BBC, as a very important arm of the British state, wants to structurally marginalise black culture and community into a peripheral space, and saying in so doing to the black population should be kept in that corner over there and will continue to the normal white audiences as the naturalised mainstream. This is total nonsense, as everyone knows it's black music that is the most popular amongst all youth in this country, and that it's already been for decades and now de facto part of the mainstream culture in Britain. It's a very manipulative and condescending racist trick that 1Xtra plays in this regard. But any study of British colonialism's approach to colonized people, you can see this pattern again and again of twisting divide and rule into some kind of white man's burden to save the oppressed communities, for which they should be eternally grateful to the white man. The black grassroots oppose racist police oppression, oppose housing crisis. They oppose deteriorating educational, employment, sports and cultural facilities. They oppose British wars abroad. On all these primary interests of black communities, Black 1Xtra is seen to work against these interests. BBC 1Xtra is an important part of the British state's surveillance, management and control in the interest of the British state within the British border, but also globally, especially in the Caribbean and Africa. The impact of 1Xtra in Africa and the Caribbean needs its own investigation and research. BBC 1Xtra helped to tear away the relative free voice and independently grassroots organised communities of pirate radio stations and the connected scene and community. 1Xtra saw the mushrooming independent black music industry by the end of the 90s and start of the 2000s, and decided to become the overseer economically and politically by injecting itself and manipulating a section of the black community for the interests of the British state and its arm of the police and army and intelligence services. Through this experience, we know at least one top broadcaster at the BBC 1Xtra, Tim Westwood, used his position there to target young black women for sexual abuse. The same man who promoted the British Army in Afghanistan to the same audiences. Those who aren't bedazzled by the colonial splendour and bright lights of the BBC, but remain loyal to the dimly lit council estates and our family and friends who live there and whose independent black resistance and liberation consciousness live therein, will and are vigilant to the racist and colonial agenda of BBC and BBC 1Xtra. One would hope that more people, especially the more prominent staff and artists who have participated in the BBC 1Xtra, can lend their voices to justice around these issues instead of being bought by a few British sterling pounds. Many thanks.